My name is Joshua Heston. I am editor-in-chief of State of the Ozarks and co-producer of Dark Ozarks, the podcast. And my initial interest in cryptozoology goes back to when I was a child, but my active, regular, ongoing research began in March of 2020 when I officially partnered with Lisa Martin of the Joplin area, and we launched the Dark Ozarks podcast. And as a part of the research, that of course includes cryptozoology, both in terms of modern day research and then also in terms of folkloric record in regards to the Ozarks primarily, but not limited to the Ozarks. We include the borderland regions and do cross-reference comparison to other areas, particularly in the United States. And so that has been a regular subject, Bigfoot included, and then cryptids as a regular subject on the podcast.
So, what did you find out in your research on Bigfoot in the Ozarks?
Well, I think the first thing that really stands out is just the number of credible sightings. There are so many credible sightings, and that research goes back for a very long time, both in Missouri and Arkansas, also in Oklahoma in particular, and Oklahoma and the Ouachitas as well. So there's an enormous number of documentation points in regards to Bigfoot in the Ozarks, and for me, certainly, it is too much anecdotal evidence to ignore.
Oh, give us some examples of what you discovered.
The from a historical standpoint, there is information dating back into the mid and even early 19th century of what are called the Blue Man over along the current river and in the early days of logging. We have reports of wild men in the Crowley Ridge and sort of Boot Heel region of Missouri, just shortly after the New Madrid earthquakes in the very early 19th century. And then we also have very contemporary reports. There was a man who's actually cousin to my publisher, who lives in near Billings, Missouri, who saw a Bigfoot type cryptid running across a field, and that was within the last 6 months. So that is a span that I think is really hard to ignore. One of the things I really, really love about the mid 19th century Blue Man documentation is it was featured in a variety of newspapers at the time. And what seems to be the situation, we're extrapolating at this point, but it seems to be that early foresters or loggers in the approximately Shannon County area near the current river, had encountered some type of community of Bigfoot. They called them the Blue Man, and that was because what they were reported seeing was essentially a cryptid that really fits the Bigfoot type description, except that they had black hair that was iridescent in the sunlight so that it would shine blue in the bright sun. And this particular encounter was reportedly quite violent. The cryptids in question frightened the men. They engaged in throwing rocks and at the men and calling, etc. And there really wasn't a resolve from what I can see in that documentation, other than the fact that the men left the area at that time.
So, about how many sightings were there of this Blue Man Bigfoot?
There's a handful of contemporary newspaper articles, again from the mid 19th century, and it suggests that there were a decent handful, enough to warrant the newspaper article. articles of the clippings that have made their way into the present. As far as a particular specific number, we don't know, but it seems to have been something that a number of men were reporting, a number of men, sometimes separately and sometimes together.
You know, the size of this blue man that they were seeing?
The implications or the inferences from the newspapers suggest a being that, in terms of general stature and appearance, outside of the black fur with the iridescent blue, really fits a traditional Bigfoot sighting, where we're talking about a bipedal um, humanoid covered with hair that is notably larger than regular human beings.
You know, I've heard of that blue color from one other person that I've interviewed, and that was in Ohio. He referred to it as this kind of this kind of a shiny black, but it was almost blue because of the when the sun shined on it, it was just very, very glistening. And he even referred to it as just actually a beautiful, beautiful coat of hair, and the way it looked. I understand when someone's frightened of a creature like this situation here, it might not look as beautiful as that, but you know, it was just outstandingly beautiful coat apparently on this the hair on this one that I interviewed. So have there been any other Bigfoot sightings in the area other than now you said that there was a cousin of a coworker?
Yes, my publisher.
Yes.
And this was in the last 6 months. He in the Billings area, rural Billings, Missouri area, saw a Bigfoot type a cryptid or figure striding across a field and navigating a fairly tall fence in a way that humans would not be able to navigate in terms of getting over it. That I think took place last November. So that's a very recent sighting, and that's a family member of my publisher for State of the Ozarks, and that's Dale Grubaugh.
Was he alone? Did he see this alone? Was there a multiple person sighting?
He was alone. He was driving.
Okay. And was it an area of a lot of population, or was it kind of a rural out from nowhere area?
It's not, because it's within approximate proximity of the Springfield metro. It's not in the middle of nowhere, but it is a predominantly rural area. It's farmland.
So what other cryptids have you researched?
Well, it's anything's up for grabs. I'm particularly interested in cryptids that follow along the lines of traditional North American folklore. And so, of course, that includes river monsters. It includes things that fly in the air, and some of the reference points of that. Things like the Paisa bird, that is particularly notable with the Cahokia Mounds in reference, and then Alton, Illinois, although that's just slightly outside of our area. And then just the river monster aspect, which is associated in my neck of the woods with the White River before it was impounded.
What type of I guess validation came from your research?
The validation on the river monsters are the validation is more difficult because of we really just we have a handful of newspaper articles in the 20th century, and so we've got that going on. There's not. It's honestly very difficult to tell that we're dealing with an area of the White River that is down in Arkansas, and it's the reports are conflicting. Some speculation it goes as far as to say it might be a deeply misplaced sea lion. Other suggestions, which might realistically be more likely, is just a very, very large catfish. So it's all over the place. The other thing in that particular regard with the newspaper is it's honestly difficult to tell if it was a hoax or not. But the one takeaway that I think is very powerful is the fact that we're dealing with regions. Of course, this is before the White River was impounded in multiple locations, and we're dealing with areas that it would not be unreasonable to have an animal of extraordinary size, quote unquote, out of place.
And why is that?
Well, predominantly because it's before heavy industrialization, and I think that that is very, very important to take into consideration. Of course, there are portions of the Ozarks that were slow to industrialize, and so you would have had in some cases, marginally different ecosystem that we have today, and in other regions, a drastically different ecosystem than what we have today. So, as well as just fewer people, and it's certainly referencing another jumping subjects, but I'm using a cross reference with the White River Monster, is the stories of extremely large snakes throughout pioneer settlement. There were stories upon stories of extraordinarily large snakes, typically snakes that were more within the what we would think of as tropical region snakes, Latin American snakes, Central African snakes, that sort of thing. And based on our experience of snakes today in North America, it's very easy to dismiss that data because we don't have snakes of that size, or typically do not have snakes of that size. And so, again, it's very easy to dismiss that. In my family's history in southern Iowa, there are two stories of extraordinarily outsized snakes. One of them dating back in my family to early settlement period in the 1840s, and it's a situation in which my great great grandfather encountered a snake that was so large that when he threw a log tie onto it, it rolled the log tie off of it, and that's a story that stands out in my family's history. And even as late as the 1940s in very southern Iowa, Lucas County, Clark County, Iowa, my mom had an experience in which they were driving down the road, a gravel road, in the midst of forest, and there was a snake that was so large. Not only was it stretching across the entire road, but it was also so large that as they were coming up on it, they thought that it was a shadow from a telephone pole. And so, these are personal experiences that we see now, and consequently, if you extrapolate that over to something like the White River Monster, let's say the White River Monster is a giant catfish that for some reason is breaching in the White River in Arkansas. An animal of that size during that time, again, we're talking, 1900 to about 1930. It's still early enough in industrial development that it's possible that an animal of that size might be residing down there. Today, I think it's less likely, although of course particularly in the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, there are many examples of especially large catfish living, for example, around the locks and dams.
I went to a conference a while back and they talked about these enormously large centipedes in Arkansas. Have you done any research on those?
I have not done any research on the centipedes yet, although I think that is incredibly fascinating, and I'm absolutely terrified of centipedes. So that is, I'll definitely do the research, but let's just say that I'll be wearing really high boots.
Well, that might be wise. I don't know. They didn't seem to think they were too scary, but they were, and very,
Okay,
very rare. So
very
chances are
cool.
you might not run into one.
I still remember the giant centipedes from Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock. So
In the show that you're doing, Dark Ozarks and beyond, um, you cover a lot of topics, I know. So what have been some of the more like sensational or surprising pieces of information you've uncovered?
wow, it's a wide gamut. We've done so many shows at this point. The I think one of the Mm, uh, the probably the most surprising bits of information that I've had the opportunity to engage with is the crossover between cryptozoology, folklore, and Native American tribal traditions, particularly along the Oklahoma border. That is really, really fascinating. Not only fascinating area of research, but it at times can become unsettling because we really begin to step outside the realm of conjecture and we start moving into honest to goodness experiences.
Like like what?
The first one that really comes to mind, and this is an interesting crossover, is the traditional lore of the Iwa. It is a Quapaw tradition that it's a spiritual entity that is both, again, very spiritual, but it is also very physical. So these are physical beings, almost in the realm of shape shifting, and they can interact and do interact, particularly in reference to tribal sacred spaces. And they typically are, the Quapaw tradition is that you rarely speak of them and you absolutely give them space. You don't mess with them. And so there's been a number of investigations that we, and particularly Lisa, my co-producer, has initiated, in which individuals were initially reporting what seemed to be hauntings, and it was generally determined, particularly in conversations with the Quapaw, that it was much more likely that they're actually dealing with Iwa, physical interaction, and that regard. The other thing that's been particularly surprising, and that is cross references with the tribal traditions, is Spooklight Road, just south of Joplin.
Describe that because our audience may not know what that is.
Right. It's Spooklight Road is County Road 50, just into Oklahoma, along the Missouri-Oklahoma border, about probably 20 miles or so south of Joplin. And it's an area that has been noted for its spooklight activity since at least the 1840s, during the Trail of Tears. And there's been a number. It's an earthlight. It's an earthlight phenomena. The light appears not just along that particular county road, but in that regional area it's approximately three county roads wide, that the phenomena appears. It appears very capriciously, but it appears at night. It appears during the daylight hours, and appears at various sizes, in various colors. It's a floating light that has been observed to move around, obviously independently of anything else, and at times split into two or more lights. It's described as a three-dimensional light, an orb that looks like a ball of plasma. It seems to at times respond to stimulus, and voices, that sort of thing. It tends to respond to people, which is uniquely unsettling and really brings up the question what it is. But the other thing that's really interesting is there's a lot of additional activity that's been recorded within that space. And the activity has ranged from phantom coyotes, or phantom coyote packs, disembodied coyotes, to shadow men, shadow figures appearing along the road. It has included, I'm trying to think of all the things. One report that is credible, is the sound of chains, the sound of footsteps and chains dragging in the night. And then one of the most unique that we just were able to begin the investigation process on was a figure that has been seen several times along the road, definitely in the cryptid category, but is described as a figure, probably 12 to 15 feet tall, and that is stalking the ridge line. And the best description is actually a Lord of the Rings style ent. Is described essentially as having arms and legs that look like tree branches, and it's moving in a very stilted manner. And the people who've seen it have found it to be extraordinarily unsettling.
Well, I would imagine. So, how many times has that been reported?
So far, we've collected the reports on that twice within a very specific area, and it's related to a specific farm uh, in the area. Now, what is really interesting, and it really begins the conjectural process between lore, tribal belief, and cryptozoology, is the fact that the area is directly in line. It's not the same location, but is directly in line with Devil's Promenade, that's on the Spring River. And Devil's Promenade, it is a crossing point. Though there used to be an old wooden bridge there that was called Devil's Promenade Bridge, and it was fairly well known. And there was a lot of settler lore that was associated with the bridge. The most notable was that in the middle of the bridge at midnight you could summon the devil, and the area has a lot of these kind of odd type phenomena associated with it. And at the point that the bridge reaches the western bank of the Spring River, just to the north of that is a massive stone column. It's very notable, and that column and that area is inaccessible to folks like us. It is Quapaw sacred land, and you cannot go onto it without permission. And permission isn't something that, my understanding is, that the Quapaw tribe grants readily. So it is considered a very important space, a very separate space, and of course, it was regarded as such before it became Quapaw tribal land. The Quapaw were moved into Oklahoma and into this region of Oklahoma. But the implication is that this was ancestral tribal land, presumably by the Osage, and that a lot of rituals took place in relationship to Devil's Promenade, or Promenade. And so it really brings up the question: at what point of the intersection do we have, if any, and I believe we do, of cryptid sightings, um, the folkloric experience or folkloric tradition, and then also uh, beings of some sort that are associated with these very traditional Native American conjurings and rituals that have gone back generations.
Do you know how that bridge, how it attained that name, Devil's Promenade?
The presumption is that it was regarded as a sacred space when the settlers first came in. Now, as something that's notable throughout the Ozarks, is that any place that's particularly rugged or creepy or has some sort of spooky lore associated with it, 9 times out of 10 gets named after the devil. We've got the devil's backbone, we've got the devil's kitchen, we've got the devil's elbow, we've got the devil's well, we've got the devil's promenade.
So it's just devil all the way.
I think so. Of course, Marble Cave at Silver Dollar City used to be known as Devil's Den. So, I think it speaks to the Scotch Irish, uh, in terms of, the Ozarks were predominantly, in terms of white settlement, the Ozarks were predominantly settled by the Scotch Irish, and we're dealing with a really unique people who, in one sense, were very heavily imbued by an evangelical Presbyterianism. I use that term very respectfully. They're deeply informed by the Bible and by that structure. And at the same time, we're also dealing with a northern Celtic people who have a unique affinity for the other world, and an appreciation or an intuitive understanding of the other and the other world, and things like the dark fae and that sort of thing. So you put those two together, you put the people in very, very rugged lands and include some interaction, sometimes very positively, sometimes very negatively, with tribal peoples. That interestingly enough, there's some very unique crossovers between ancient Celtic, pardon me, ancient Celtic beliefs and many tribal beliefs, particularly in terms of things like the little people and what we would classify as the Fae, the Irish Fae. And I think that it's fair to conjecture that there was a decent amount of relationship, cultural relationship or kinship that was noticed between those peoples, particularly, for example, the Scots Irish and the Cherokee. And so you look at those points of crossover, the fact that they had commonality in terms of their cosmology, really their worldviews or their supernatural worldviews, and putting all of that together, it really puts up a sort of a point of interest whenever you see something that's named after the devil and in the Ozarks.
Well, this may be a little bit beyond what your research has taken you, but oftentimes when I'm interviewing people on the subject matter, I get some insight as to, we can't take the experiencer out of the experience. How much of
Yes.
this do you think is, is is something that the person is creating or participating in creating as far as their reality goes or their perception of reality?
I think that that's a really good question, and I think that the simple answer is it depends on the person. The one of the reasons I really like reports, cryptid reports specific to Bigfoot before, say, about 1950, is that the likelihood of cultural contamination or the expectation or the idea in someone's head is vastly lower. The idea that maybe I watched it on TV, maybe I heard about it on the radio, maybe I read about this, and then I imagined then something happened, something inexplicable happened, and my brain sort of filled in the parts around it. Well, the brain cannot fill in specific parts if it's never had those parts given to it. And the same question has arisen in regards to a long-standing history of fairy abductions in Ireland. One going so far as to say that the fairy abductions may actually be UFO encounters, but the human mind was been unable to classify the experience based on just lack of context, literally an alien experience, and that the result of that is that the mind sort of went home to play in the folklore that it knew best, which was fairy folklore, and filled in around it. And so that created a memory. I think that's an incredibly fascinating cultural point of analysis. And at the same time, say going back to the 1840s, 1850s, with the loggers in the current river area of Missouri, reporting the Blue Man, which is essentially a Bigfoot. They did not have Bigfoot lore upon which to derive any opinions, and yet they're reporting something presumably fairly objectively, just saying, "Wow, this is what my experience is," and that I think lends a lot of credence to these old reports. There's another report in the Gainesville area of a little girl, I believe in the 1940s, 1950s, who had a very close-up encounter with a Bigfoot cryptid, and it was terrifying, but she literally did not have words for it. Carried that story. She tried to explain it to her father. He went and got the gun. They went down and looked. There was no animal. There was no cryptid to be seen. Um, moves on with her life, and some 20 years later, after her family gets television, she's watching a show, and they start talking about Bigfoot, and she's going, that describes my experience. Those are the ones that I really like, because we know that the mind isn't being sort of primed beforehand for the experience.
That brings us to kind of the ghost phenomena. What have you researched on that, and what have you concluded?
Well, we do a lot of investigation research, a lot of investigations as well as a lot of research, and something that really began. Dark Ozarks was my partnership with Lisa Martin, and she's a longtime founder of Paranormal Science Lab in the Joplin area. So even before I was on the scene, Lisa and her team were doing investigations regularly, and I've been brought in on that. So doing regular investigations at this point is quite normal, and that was new to me about 2018, but it's something I've actually gotten pretty used to and enjoy. And you know, if we could say exactly what ghost or paranormal phenomena is, um, I could probably retire to the Riviera, let's face it. But there's a lot of things about it we don't know. There's a lot of things about it we don't understand. But what we do know is that the phenomena occurs. It occurs regularly. It occurs in many places. It occurs with a high degree of frequency. And some aspects of that phenomena are aspects that can be documented with the right tools. Interestingly enough, I think it's an important caveat that those tools are not actually ghost hunting tools. They're tools used for other things, but they record energy, they record static electricity, they record audio, obviously, in at various times. So lots and lots of compiled data. The interpretation of the data is, of course, up for argument, but I definitely have my own personal opinions on all of that as well.
What are you measuring? What kind of tools are you using out there in the field to, and what kind of data would you get from that?
The probably the most responsive, most important is simply measuring electromagnetic fields, EMF detectors, and that's really effective just in terms of looking for energy spikes. And from what we can tell, when spirit manifests itself, there is an increase in energy at times. It is not the same across the board, but many times within a quote unquote haunted location, we will experience fairly dramatic energy spikes after we've concluded that it is not an energy spike, for example, an unshielded electrical outlet or a cell phone or a refrigerator or a breaker box, that sort of thing. And so what an EMF detector does, it's not precise in terms of saying, "Oh my goodness, there's a ghost." But what it does is it allows you to map the space in real time and document what is occurring within that space on an energetic level, and then begin to extrapolate from there. The other that is actually a very simple tool is using high quality aircraft aluminum mag lights and setting the flashlights so that they're just off, meaning that there's you basically screw them in until they're tight, and then at which point the flashlight is on, and then unscrew them carefully until they just go off. Carefully set them on a table on a flat surface, and quite frankly, invite any visiting energies to interact with the flashlights. And if the basic gist is that if an energetic um, space interacts, it will cross the barrier, allow a connection between the light and the battery, and allow them to come on. And that is a very interesting thing to watch. That was one of my first experiences with an investigation when I was very green as a paranormal investigator. It was very fascinating, a little freaky first time, and at that point, we are also typically doing audio recording to see if we pick up any EVPs, electronic voice phenomena.
And have you picked up any?
Yes, on a fairly regular basis. At times, it can be what sounds like garbled voices. At other times, it can be full-on voices and words. And at certain times, words that appear to be spoken in response to questions that the actual flesh and blood investigators are asking.
And what are they saying generally? Maybe any full sentences, any kind of a message they're trying to give you, or is it just random words?
It's the good EVPs, and they're not tons and tons of EVPs, but working with Paranormal Science Lab, I'd say that they've probably collected about 2 dozen really solid EVPs and or electronic voice phenomena snippets, and typically it's not terribly lengthy. It's a handful of words, but it it is data that appears to be in response to a question or a comment. Oftentimes, you can tell if it's a male or a female voice. Sometimes dialect will show through. Um, it's fairly common for that. Sometimes they're grumpy. Other times they just seem to be inquisitive or answering the question. Of course, we do the EMF detectors. We typically do a static detector as well, static electricity detector. We do the sound recordings for voice phenomena, and typically we have some sort of camcorder in use or video camera in use. Just looking for the thing that typically shows up on video is light artifacts. Sometimes the light artifacts are simply that they're explain very explicable light refraction based on the location. In other cases, you can really see interesting light phenomena, lights moving in very odd ways, not in relationship to the camera, that sort of thing. The still photography orbs typically are something to be very skeptical of, but some of the other data, like the fully formed words that appear to be in response to a question, as well as oddly moving light patterns, and then flashlights and EMF detectors and static detectors that appear to be responding specifically to questions. Those are the mainstays.
What about thermal imaging? Have you ever tried that? I heard the other day that if there is sometimes in a ghostly setting that they will actually measure the cold in the room. A lot. Have you heard of that?
Yes, I've not utilized thermal imaging at this point, but I know that Lisa and her team, other portions of her team have, and cold spots are pretty common in terms of a quote unquote ghost manifestation.
Any logic behind that? Why it would be cold?
It seems to be associated with energy. The approximate supposition at this point is that ghosts are energy, and they pull energy from a space in order to have more energy. Essentially, they eat up energy. It's one of the reasons that it's believed that battery drain happens in ghost haunted spaces a lot, and it does. Certain spaces will drain the batteries on pretty much all of your equipment really quickly. The idea is that the energy space, the sentient energy space, is pulling energy in order to attempt to manifest. And so the idea that within a space, if it's pulling all the energy to it in that space, the energy around it might become cooler.
What else does the show cover?
We cover noir history throughout the entire Ozarks, of course, cryptozoology, um, and paranormal experiences, as well as folkloric traditions, hoodoo, voodoo, and practical magic, witchcraft, and then in terms of noir history, that includes everything from early settlement, range wars. Um, Bushwhackers, vigilantes, the Civil War, all the way up to cowboys, outlaws, the gangster era, and sometimes unsolved crime.
Wow, you just cover everything. Let's go back with voodoo. What have you discovered on that one?
Well, the really the thing that I think is particularly interesting, voodoo and its counterpart hoodoo, is surprisingly prolific in the Ozarks, and has been for uh, since early settlement. And I have an enormous amount of respect for voodoo as an organized religion, which it is, and also for its I think its importance in the collective narrative, in terms of how people, particularly African peoples into the Americas, really dealt with their traditional religion under essentially under siege, uh, first under French colonization or French rule, and then spreading that out into the southern United States. But something that oftentimes gets overlooked is that Missouri and Arkansas, because of the rivers, were closely affiliated with downriver culture, down Mississippi culture, and of course that it very much includes New Orleans. New Orleans as a cultural center throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century had a lot of impact on the Ozark spaces that were within proximity of river access, and before lake impoundments that included a lot of the inland Ozarks Plateau.
So does voodoo work? Have you had any evidence of that?
Yes, I am quite convinced voodoo works. The the history of it, as well as personal, both from a voodoo standpoint and then also from a hoodoo standpoint. Hoodoo is separate from voodoo, although that they do have some points of intersection in terms of their practice and cultural impact. That the conjurings, when done correctly, the conjurings, the meditative processes, yes, they do work. I get really excited about is that the dark history, the folklore, the ghost stories, all of these things. Some of them, it's very important to understand that it's they are stories. In some cases, they're points of folklore. Some of the more modern ones are points of urban legend. It's very important to understand that those we can't document. It's also important to understand that there are in many cases, both in terms of our historic record, as well as modern investigation, et cetera, that does provide real documentation. And that is, first of all, it's incredibly exciting. Second of all, the noir history, the dark history, these types of things create a texture and a tapestry to our culture and to our region. It gives our region a sense of space. And over and over, I have spoken, particularly with younger people in their teens or early 20s, and they might have grown up here in, particularly, my area, Hollister, Branson, and they don't know these stories, and they don't know the Civil War history that took place here. They don't know the vigilante history that took place here. They don't know the buildings that are reported to be haunted, or in some cases documentably are haunted, like the Old English Inn in downtown Hollister. And we could be bumming around, and I could start telling them some of these things, and I watch their eyes light up, and they go, seriously, like, we live in a cool place. I had no idea. And they're right. We do live in a very cool place. And these layers and layers and layers of stories give us a sense of narrative, a sense of place. They help inform us of who we are, where we came from, and even if some of those young people, leave the Ozarks and career wise, professionally, may never interact with the Ozarks, they can carry with them these stories, and I think that's very important. It's very important for human beings to have a sense of mooring, to have a sense of a lineage and a line to someplace that means something. That people went on before, and cool things happened, or really dark, scary things happened. But it's a very interesting, powerful tapestry, and it really serves as an inner voice to say that the place that I came from meant something. It still means something. It's worth preserving. It's worth carrying on the stories.